Hello, dear listeners. I'm Nermeen Abdelhamid, Communications and Visibility Officer at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, the regional office for the Middle East and North Africa. And today's episode of the Global Compact for Migration podcast series looks at UNODC's work in relation to the Global Compact for Migration, or the GCM, and how data from the recently released Global Report on Trafficking in Persons from UNODC can help us better achieve the GCM. The Global Compact for Migration podcast series aims to have a conversation with people from across the Middle East and North Africa during the GCM regional review on the importance of making migration work for all and to reflect on the GCM's 23 objectives and their associated actionable commitments to help achieve orderly, safe, and regular migration. And today I'm glad to be speaking to Ms. Cristina Albertin, UNODC Regional Representative for the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you for being with us, Ms. Albertin.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Nermin.
Can you tell us about UNODC and its work in relation to the GCM?
Yes, definitely I can. And I think that the work of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime is very closely related to the Global Compact on Migration. And this is because UNODC, since more than 2 decades, is working against organized crime, transnational organized crime. And our mandate is enshrined in an international instrument, the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, which has two specific protocols related to human trafficking
Mm-hmm.
and smuggling of migrants. And if you look
Mm-hmm.
at the GCM, there are several objectives that relate to this work, specifically objective number 9, which looks at strengthening the transnational response to smuggling of migrants, the objective 10, which focuses on preventing, combating, and eradicating trafficking in persons, and also objective 11, about managing borders in an integrated, secure, and coordinated manner.
In reference to this, how could we differentiate between smuggling of migrants and trafficking in persons?
This is actually a very important point, and in the public debate, we very often see that these two terms are used without distinction. And actually, the convention that I was just mentioning, the real value of this convention is that first, it has recognized both trafficking in human beings and smuggling of migrants as forms of transnational organized crime that have to be institutionalized as serious crimes in domestic legislation, and also that
Mm-hmm.
they are two different crimes. So when you look at the definition of the protocol on trafficking in persons, you will find that trafficking in persons means that a person is recruited, transported, harbored by using the means of force, abduction, coercion, abuse, deception for the purpose of exploitation. And this is really the distinction. This is the distinctive element to smuggling of migrants. Trafficking in human beings always implies exploitation. And this can
Yes.
mean different forms of
Mm-hmm.
exploitation. It could be sexual exploitation, forced labor, organ trafficking, illegal adoption, forced marriage, and maybe other forms, that might be different in different contexts in different countries. Whereas if you look at the definition of smuggling of migrants, this is basically a crime against the state because the smuggling of migrants has been defined as the procurement in order to obtain directly or indirectly a financial or other material benefit of the illegal entry of a person into a state party of which the person is not a national or a permanent resident. So it's basically the illegal entry into a country facilitated by a smuggler for a person. So there is not this element of exploitation, although
Mm-hmm.
exploitation can also happen afterwards, but that's a different story.
Yes. And would you say when looking at the GCM, we can see how Objective 1 highlights how important it is to collect and utilize accurate and disaggregated data as a basis for evidence-based policies? And also this month, UNODC released the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons for 2020. What would you say is the significance of enhancing data collection in the fight against smuggling and trafficking crimes?
Well, it cannot be overemphasized the need for data collection and data analysis. As we all know, evidence policy is a key instrument to have effective policies. Since the entry into force of the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, actually UNODC has started to collect the data on trafficking in persons. That means since 2004. And if you look at our consecutive reports that have been published, and you just mentioned the last one that was just recently released, we really have been able to obtain more and more data. And of course, one of the most important factors, we want to know how many victims are there. So our numbers, of course, they are limited to the detected victims, and we can assume that there are many, many more victims. But then, of course, we also want to know, like, for example, what is the gender of the victims, what is the age of the victim, what has been the socioeconomic situation of the victim, because that will give us leads towards the vulnerability of the victims. So if I may just look at this year's report, what was highlighted, for example, is the increase in child trafficking. In general, we see that out of 10 victims, 5 are adult women and 2 are girls. But 1/3 of all victims are children. And we have among them 19% girls and 15% boys. And in recent years, we see that more boys are being trafficked. In the past, we always thought, and you see from the numbers, that now 15 and 19 are coming close. Now we see that there is a trend that even more boys are being trafficked. And that might have to do with the ongoing crisis, first in the Middle East and North Africa. We have a lot of countries in conflict and in post-conflict. Mm-hmm. And now the impact has been compounded also by COVID. And let me also say that the numbers that I mentioned are global numbers. But when we look at specific numbers for Middle East and North Africa, the number of trafficked boys is, or the share of trafficked boys is already higher than of the share of girls.
That's very interesting. And if we can go to reflect more on objective 2 of the GCM, could the vulnerabilities faced by a migrant make him or her more prone to be a victim of human trafficking?
Yeah, definitely. I believe so. And I think also our report hints to this and has the numbers for it. I think it's very clear that, you know, the status of a person, a person who's migrating, and his or her status can be used against a possible human trafficking victims. Because if you don't have a permission to work or to stay in a country where you are, it's exploited. I mean, how can you defend yourself? I mean, you will always have the fear of being exposed as an irregular migrant. And traffickers might also use this because they typically threaten to file reports with the authorities, and that will easily increase the vulnerability of the victim to the exploitative condition, and also impede the victim to seek help, because the victim will have to expose him or herself that she or he has come into the country under illegal conditions. So if we look at this year's reports, the report found that migrants make up a significant share of the detected victims in most global regions. So for example, in Western and Southern Europe, it is 65%, and in the Middle East, it is also as high as 60%. So on one hand, labor migrants, you know, if they might even have a permit to work, but still they are vulnerable to exploitation because they might not be aware of the existing labor rights in the country, and they probably might not have the means to seek or to enforce their rights. And then I also would like to mention, you know, there is also, under the exploitation of people, we also see a trend to use trafficking victims for criminal activities. And this is even more difficult. So if we look, for example, at the last report, we talk about children that have been trafficked for the purpose of drug trafficking. You can just imagine if a child is being caught, is being arrested by the police for drug trafficking, it will be very difficult for the person or for the child to make his or her case in the police. But I also want to mention in this regard that the UNTOC and the TIP protocol clearly establish that when a crime is committed by a victim of human trafficking, which results from the fact to have been trafficked, the victim cannot be held accountable for that crime.
That leads me to ask, as you had mentioned earlier, UNODC's mandate focuses on strengthening member states' transnational response to smuggling of migrants, which correlates to Objective 9 of the GCM. Could you please explain this point a bit clearer?
Mhm. Yeah, actually, I think this objective of the GCM how should I say, reinforces the objective of UNODC's work against smuggling of migrants. And if we look at the protocol that I was mentioning before, and which defines clearly what smuggling of migrants is, it also sets out what member states should be doing to comprehensively respond to this transnational organized crime. And the first very important step is that each country criminalizes smuggling of migrants. And as I said, it should be criminalized as a serious crime with the respective sentences. And this is the first thing, that countries should have their own laws and then develop the institutional response to it. And when we talk about institutional response, then it means that we need to strengthen the capacity to investigate and to prosecute. So to bring the smugglers behind bars. So UNODC is specializing on strengthening and enhancing the criminal justice response, working with police officers, with first responders, the law enforcement officials that maybe sit at the borders, with the prosecutors and with the judges, so that they can understand the international law, but also the national law, and then apply it accordingly. And we should not forget, since we talked about smuggling of migrants as a transnational organized crime, we need regional and international cooperation, especially among those countries along the smuggling routes from origin through transit and to destination. And UNODC is helping to set up these mechanisms, which, for example, are called the mutual legal assistance mechanisms. We can also bring these countries together, as we have done in North Africa and in the Middle East. We have organized, for example, fora with prosecutors from African countries and destination countries in Europe, where prosecutors can see how they can improve their cooperation in dismantling networks of smugglers. And let me also mention here, as we have a global tip report, we also did our first global report on smuggling of migrants, which is also a very important tool for the entire international community to better understand the phenomenon and to understand that this is nothing that can just be addressed in a national context, but it has to be addressed through regional and international cooperation.
And do you think that after highlighting UNODC's work to preventing smuggling of migrants, can you please tell us more about the efforts to stop trafficking in persons in the context of international migration?
Yeah, definitely. And I can say that actually the protocol against human trafficking has similar features as the protocol against smuggling of migrants, because we always have to look at criminalizing the offense. So in this case, we also have to criminalize and penalize trafficking in human beings. And we also have to, and what we do, we also have to increase the capacity to prosecute and investigate. And as you can see from our last tip report, now 90% of all countries that have ratified the convention, they also have criminalized trafficking in persons. And this is really great. However, we also see the longer a country already has a law, the more cases it can also prosecute. And we see slow but steady progress in an increase of the convicted perpetrators in human trafficking. So this is very important. But when we talk about trafficking in persons, we need to do more, because the protocol also talks to us about strengthening prevention and strengthening the protection of the victims and the survivors. And as we all know, the victims, once a victim has been rescued, the person needs immediately support, be it medical support,
Yes.
psychological support, legal support, and then later, of course, also economic support, rehabilitation, rehabilitation. And talking about international human trafficking or cross-border trafficking, the victims have to be reintegrated into their countries and they need support in this. And there again, it's very important that countries work together and that the victims can also be repatriated back into their countries. And we also need to work with the communities there that they accept these victims back, because sometimes we also still have a mindset of shaming the victim, which should not be the case. So definitely support to victims is something very important in the response. And as UNODC, we also work with countries to set up, for example, comprehensive institutional responses. And you might have seen that several of the countries in our region, in the MENA region, they have set up national committees to deal with human trafficking. So they usually have a mandate to address all the provisions that the protocol in human trafficking is setting out, namely penalization, criminalization, prevention, and protection. And let me just briefly also mention that prevention, of course, is very important, but it's a very broad and a very comprehensive concept, and it goes beyond awareness raising. Awareness raising is very important, especially at transport points, but it has to go into the schools, it has to go into the communication, it has to be community based. And this is what
Yes.
we work on, developing such policies together with the national committees. And finally,
Yes.
as we said, research is very important. Our blow tip report can only exist also when governments provide us with the respective data on how the crime is happening and how the response is being institutionalized. So I think this is a very comprehensive report support that we are looking into enlisting with the member states.
Thank you so much, Ms. Christina. While we would have wanted to continue talking about all the relevant aspects and all the important conversations we need to have, we ran short on time. So I'm very, very grateful for your time today and for the conversation. And thank you very much, dear listeners, for joining us in this important conversation. And please tell us what you think of the discussion, your views, comments in the section below. And feel free to explore the helpful links added in the description and stay tuned for the rest of the podcast within our Global Compact for Migration series.